Welcome to another episode of Mizuho Markets Mindset. My name is Josh Weismer, and I'm here with my colleague, Rich Soto, to talk about the state of the IPO market. So, Rich, we're through the first month of the year, and it's been an incredibly busy start so far from an IPO perspective. We've got 7 deals at a price so far to raise just over $2.5 billion. Average offer to current right now and performance of those deals has been a little mixed, with most of them are average around flat right now, and a number of IPOs that are expected to price over the next couple of weeks. But I'm curious to get your take on what you're seeing in the TMT market, and what does the pipeline look like, and what subsectors within TMT do you see being important throughout 2026?
So Josh, we've seen a very positive macro backdrop across the board, which has led to a really positive TMT pipeline. We've seen that across geographies, whether that's European, Asian, Latin American companies coming to market, and the pipeline is looking robust across subsectors. We're seeing fintech, software, internet, obviously a lot of these very high profile AI names as well that are preparing and looking to launch either in 2026 or the early part of 2027. I think one of the things that we're also seeing is the SEC backlog became very constrained with the government shutdown. We're easing off of that now. So the companies that are looking to kick off processes today are probably going to be more or less in time for a summer of 2026 IPO. What are you seeing, Josh?
Yeah, really one of the things that I noticed this year is the increase in activity from the sponsors. If you look at 2025, there were 20 private equity backed deals versus 14 in 2024. And we've seen a lot more activity at the start of the new year here. The Medline deal toward the end of last year obviously went very well. It's trading up 50% from its IPO price. And we're seeing all of the sponsors look at the IPO market as a viable exit path for their portfolio companies after, again, similar to the TMT space, having a 3 or 4 year lull in activity from the financial sponsor community. And I think that if you look at 20 deals in 2025, it's quite likely, given what we've seen in the market right now, that we have double that from a public IPO standpoint. So I think if you look and canvass the top 20 financial sponsors, each of those names has somewhere between 2 and 4 portfolio companies that they're contemplating taking out, whether it's in 2026 or 2027. So it feels like that's shaping up to be a very robust year from a sponsor standpoint. And from a sector standpoint, industrials continues to be incredibly busy. There's a number of defense technology companies that are either on the road, have priced recently, or queuing up to go public later this year. And that seems like that's going to be a very prolific area of the capital markets for a while. But also on the consumer side, I was down at ICR a couple of weeks ago, and the sentiment down there was as positive as it's been in several years. And we're already seeing some sponsor-backed consumer names and some non-sponsor-backed consumer names starting to line up and think about an IPO in 2026. I'm curious to get your take, and you talked about AI, and obviously not only in AI, but in some other sectors as well. There are some incredibly large transactions out there that are rumored to be coming, whether it's in 2026 or 2027. And by large, I mean some potentially bigger than the largest IPO of all time to date. I'm curious to get your take on market saturation and volume, and is there enough demand out there on the part of the buy side to have some of these deals get done, but also leave enough on the table for the smaller transactions to occur over the next 12 months?
We're seeing very clear preparations from some of these best-in-class mega cap private companies that are looking to access the U.S. public markets for the first time. Each situation is very particular, but I think the tactics around these IPOs will be different than just doing your typical $500 million or $1 billion IPO. I think we will see very robust friends and family rounds. We will see very robust cornerstone investments as part of any of these IPO processes. If you're looking to raise 25, 50, $100 billion from a market saturation perspective, you'll see certain processes that are just different to what we typically see. We expect, because of the cap structures of these companies are already full from the long only investors, sovereign wealth funds. We expect these to continue to support these deals on the public markets. So we would anticipate, if you're raising, say, a $50 billion IPO, to have $10, $20, $30 billion spoken for ahead of launching this IPO. That will make a pretty big difference from an execution perspective versus what we see in a typical IPO. I think investors are incredibly excited about these prospects. I think there's a premium for growth, and these companies are all, as you know, very high growth, and there's not a lot of exposure currently that investors have to these best-in-class AI stories. And then some of them are just, they're just different than everything out there that's in the public markets. People have been constrained in how they can invest on the public side in some of these, large, best-in-class large companies because they've just stayed private for so long. I think for the first time in 2026 and early 27, they're going to get access to us, and we expect very robust demand for that.
A lot has been made about the Fed and the impact that some of the rate cuts last year had on the stock market. And we see right now where the Fed is heading in 2026. What do you think the biggest impact that's had on the IPO market and equity capital markets in general?
Josh, I think what we've seen now that President Trump has made his Fed pick, I think people will be very focused on the underlying data on inflation and how sort of the expectations for just general investor confidence, the general data around GDP growth and inflation sort of translate into the expectations for this new Fed chairman sort of throughout the whole year. The impact from a macro perspective, we've been in a bit of a super cycle in which we've had steady equity gains now for a couple of years, and that hasn't yet translated into the IPO market, in great part because small and mid cap have vastly underperformed the sort of large cap and mega cap names. If we continue to see a Fed that is cutting rates, we'll see outperformance from small and mid cap names, which should translate into a more robust IPO market. So Josh, on your end, how do you see sort of the breadth of the market, and not only that, but who is going to be selling into IPOs from a sector and from a stakeholder perspective?
I think one of the things that we're seeing in 2026 early and moving into deals that we see in the pipeline, what we've been pitching is we've now got a market that's focused. We talked about mid caps a little bit. I think you're going to see deal sizes across the spectrum this year. I think that's one of the things that we see in a more robust IPO market, which I think we're in right now, that deals from down to 150 million to tens of billions of dollars can get done in this market. And I think the other thing that we're seeing right now is a broadening out of sector exposure. We talked about TMT, we talked about industrials. There's a lot going on in biotech right now. The biotech overall capital raising landscape has been incredible for the last 6 months or so. And we've already seen biotech IPOs kick off the year. We've got several on the road right now and a lot lining up in the pipeline. So having this broad exposure to the IPO market from a sector standpoint, I think is really healthy and really speaks to the health of the IPO market and the demand that we're seeing on the institutional investor side to put capital to work in the IPO product to try to drive alpha across their portfolio. And we saw $46 billion of IPO issuance in 2025, and putting those large multi-tens of billions of dollars deals on the shelf for a second, I think it's quite likely that we could see double that in 2026, just given what we're seeing in the market right now, given the velocity out of the gate that we've seen so far, and given the pitch activity, financial sponsors, VC firms that are looking to get liquidity in their portfolio after not having it for several years, I think is really building up to what should be a very successful IPO market in 2026. Rich, thanks a lot for joining me, and appreciate everybody taking the time to hear our views on the capital markets in 2026. It feels like it's going to be an incredibly robust year for IPOs. And to the extent that you're thinking about accessing the public markets, please reach out to your Mizuho banker so we can give you our advice and thoughts on the process.